Welcome to Bedtime Stories. Mr. Possum. Mr. Possum lived in a tree in the woods where Mr. Bear lived, and one morning, just before spring, Mr. Possum awoke very hungry. He ran around to Mr. Squirrel's house and tried to get an invitation to breakfast, but Mr. Squirrel had only enough for himself. He knew that Mr. Possum always lived on his neighbors when he could, so he said, "Of course you have been to breakfast long ago, Mr. Possum. You are such a smart fellow, so I will not offer you any." Mr. Possum, of course, said he had, and that he only dropped in to make a call. He was on his way to Mr. Rabbit's house. But he met with no better success at Mr. Rabbit's, for he only put his nose out of the door, and when he saw who was there said, "I am as busy as I can be, getting ready for my spring planting. Will you come in and help sort seeds?" Mr. Rabbit knew the easiest way to be rid of Mr. Possum was to ask him to work. "I would gladly help you," replied Mr. Possum, "but I am in a great hurry this morning. I have some important business with Mr. Bear, and I only stopped to say how do you do. Mr. Bear, I am afraid, will not be receiving today," said Mr. Rabbit. "It is rather early for him to be up, isn't it? I thought as the sun was nice and warm, he might venture out, and I thought it would please him to have me there to welcome him," said Mr. Possum. "Besides that, I wish to see him on business." Now, Mr. Possum knew well enough that Mr. Bear would not be up, and he wanted to find him sleeping, and soundly too. He went to the door and knocked softly. Then he waited, and as he did not hear any moving inside, he went to a window and looked in. There was Mr. Bear's chair and pipe, just as he left them when he went to bed. He looked in the bedroom window, and he could see in the bed a big heap of bedclothes, and just the tiniest tip of Mr. Bear's nose. Mr. Possum listened, and he trembled a little, for he could hear Mr. Bear breathing very loud, and it sounded anything but pleasant. "Oh, he is sound asleep for another week," said Mr. Possum. "What is the use of being afraid?" He walked around the house until he came to the pantry window. Then he stopped and raised the sash. He put in one foot and sat on the sill and listened. All was still, so he slid off to the floor. Mr. Possum looked around Mr. Bear's well-filled pantry. He did not know where to begin. He was so hungry. He became so interested and was so greedy that he forgot all about that he was in Mr. Bear's pantry, and he stayed on and ate and ate. Then he fell asleep, and the first thing he knew, a pair of shining eyes were looking in the window, and a big head with a red mouth full of long white teeth was poked into the pantry. Mr. Possum thought his time had come, so he just closed his eyes and pretended he was dead, but he peeked a little so as to see what happened. The big head was followed by a body, and when it was on the sill, Mr. Possum saw it was Mr. Fox, and the next thing he knew, Mr. Fox came off the sill with a bang and hit a pan of beans and then knocked over a jar of preserves. The noise was enough to awaken all the bears for miles around, and Mr. Possum was frightened nearly to death, for he heard Mr. Bear growling in the next room. While Mr. Fox was on the floor and trying to get up on his feet, Mr. Possum jumped up and was out of the window like a flash. Mr. Fox saw something, but he did not know what, and before he could make his escape, The door of the pantry opened, and there stood Mr. Bear, with a candle in his hand, looking in. Oh, he growled. So you are trying to rob me while I'm taking my sleep. And he sprang at Mr. Fox. Wait, said Mr. Fox. Let me explain, my dear Mr. Bear. You are mistaken. I was trying to protect your home. I saw your window open and knew you were asleep. And when I got in the window, the thief attacked me and nearly killed me, and now you are blaming me for it. You are most ungrateful. I shall know another time what to do. Mr. Bear looked at him. His mouth did not show any signs of food, and Mr. Fox opened his mouth and told him to look. I wonder who it could have been, he said, when he was satisfied that Mr. Fox was not the thief. It may have been that possum fellow. I'll go over to his house in the morning. The next morning, Mr. Bear called on Mr. Opossum. He found him sleeping soundly, and when he at last opened the door, he was rubbing his eyes as though he was not half awake. Why, how do you do? He said when he saw Mr. Bear. I did not suppose you were up yet. You didn't? Asked Mr. Bear. And then he stared at Mr. Possum's coat. What is the matter with your coat? He asked. You have white hairs sticking out all over you, and the rest of your coat is almost white too. Now, Mr. Possum had a black coat before, and he ran to the mirror and looked at himself. It was true. He was almost white. He knew what had happened. He was so frightened when he was caught in Mr. Bear's pantry by Mr. Fox and heard Mr. Bear growl that he had turned nearly white with fright. I have been terribly ill, he told Mr. Bear, going back to the door, and I have been here all alone this winter. It was a terrible sickness. I guess that is what has caused it. Mr. Bear went away, shaking his head. That fellow is crafty, he said. I feel sure he was the thief, and yet he certainly does look sick. After that, all the opossums were of dull white color, with long white hairs scattered here and there over their fur. They were never able to outgrow the mark the thieving Mr. Possum left upon his race. Where the sparks go. One night, when the wind was blowing and it was clear and cold out of doors, a cat and a dog, who were very good friends, sat dozing before a fireplace. The wood was snapping and crackling, making the sparks fly. Some flew up the chimney, others settled into coals in the bed of the fireplace, while others flew out on the hearth and slowly closed their eyes and went to sleep. One spark ventured farther out upon the hearth and fell very near Pussy. This made her jump, which awakened the dog. That almost scorched your fur coat, Miss Pussy, said the dog. No, indeed, answered the cat. I am far too quick to be caught by those silly sparks. Why do you call them silly? Asked the dog. I think them very good to look at, and they help to keep us warm. Yes, that is all true, said the cat. But those that fly up the chimney on a night like this certainly are silly, when they could be warm and comfortable inside. For my part, I cannot see why they fly up the chimney. The spark that flew so near Pussy was still winking, and she blazed up a little when she heard the remark the cat made. If you knew our reason, you would not call us silly, she said. You cannot see what we do, but if you were to look up the chimney and see what happens if we are fortunate enough to get out at the top, you would not call us silly. The dog and cat were very curious to know what happened, but the spark told them to look and see for themselves. Pussy was very cautious and told the dog to look first, so he stepped boldly up to the fireplace and thrust his head in. He quickly withdrew it, for his hair was singed, which made him cry and run to the other side of the room. Miss Pussy smoothed her soft coat and was very glad she had been so wise. She walked over to the dog and urged him to come nearer the fire, but he realized why a burnt child dreads the fire and remained at a safe distance. Pussy walked back to the spark and continued to question it. "We cannot go into the fire," she said. "Now, pretty bright spark, do tell us what becomes of you when you fly up the chimney. I am sure you only become soot, and that cannot make you long to get to the top." "Oh, you are very wrong," said the spark. "We are far from being black when we fly up the chimney, for once we reach the top, we live forever sparkling in the sky. You can see, if you look up the chimney, all of our brothers and sisters who have been lucky and reached the top, winking at us almost every night. Sometimes the wind blows them away, I suppose, for there are nights when we cannot see the sparks shine." "Who told you all that?" said the cat. "Did any of the sparks ever come back and tell you they could live forever?" "Oh no," said the spark, "but we can see them, can we not? And of course, we all want to shine forever." "I said you were silly," said the cat, "and now I know it. Those are not sparks you see, they are stars in the sky." "You can call them anything you like," replied the spark, "but we make the bright light you see." "Well, if you take my advice," said the cat, "you will stay right in the fireplace, for once you reach the top of the chimney out of sight, you go. The stars you see twinkling are far above the chimney, and you never could reach them." But the spark would not be convinced. Just then, someone opened a door, and the draft blew the spark back into the fireplace. In a few minutes, it was flying with the others toward the top of the chimney. Pussy watched the fire a minute and then looked at the dog. "The spark may be right, after all," said the dog. "Let us go out and see if we can see it." Pussy stretched herself and blinked. "Perhaps it is true," she replied. "Anyway, I will go with you and look." Rest well and wake up refreshed for a brand new day. Good night.